Chapter 6 of the book, 3 Religious Rebels. This chapter is entitled, Parallel Lines Never Meet. Robert sat struggling to capture a very tantalizing but very elusive memory. He was trying to recall what the look in his prior's eyes reminded him of. For 4 months now, he had passed through this same teasing experience daily. Every time Father Antoine left his room, Robert would strain after that memory which ever remained just out of reach. He was striving hard to like this middle-aged, broad-shouldered man with the short neck and the head that jutted out from his shoulders like the head of a duck. He had found him acting as prior when he came to Tonnerre. He had left him at this post. The man was capable enough, but Robert did not like his too easy acquiescence, his smiling obsequiousness, and his over-facile tongue. He had often studied those wide-set, small eyes that looked at him from above a veritable beak of a nose, and from below a narrow forehead that was split in the center by an arrowhead of thin black hair. It was the look in those eyes that puzzled him. It stirred something in his memory that simply would not come out beyond the veils and be seen in the clear light of the intellect. 4 months of effort had yielded nothing. The look was still there. The stirring of the memory was still there. And the elusiveness was still there. Robert shrugged his shoulders. He snorted derisively at himself and put the prior out of his mind. 4 full months had elapsed since the morning he left St. Pierre's with tears in his heart. He felt as if he were uprooting his life that morning. The first wrench had come as he embraced Father Maurice. Robert was surprised at the depth of his love for his monastery. But Tonnerre did much to make him forget, for it welcomed him warmly. The sincerity of that welcome had thrilled the young abbot and set his secret hopes soaring. With men as cordial as this, he thought, he could do much. Of his hopes he said nothing as yet. He wanted to know his men, and he wanted his men to know him before he told them what had been the rapture and the anguish of his soul since the day he said, "I vow." He found St. Michael's little different from St. Pierre's. The community was of the same size, and there was much about the ground plan of the monastic buildings to make him feel at home. He had spent a few weeks examining the property. He found the granges in excellent order, the buildings in good repair, and the serfs contented and industrious. He was very well pleased with the condition of the cattle and the appearance of the soil. Everything bespoke the diligence and the ability of the cellarer. He smiled to himself as he said that it would not take a great amount of talent or intelligence to be a bestial feudal lord of this domain. The cellarer would allow him to be the figurehead. The community, of course, absorbed him. His years as prior had been excellent preparation for his present position. He had little trouble roughly classifying his community. As usual, he found the very fervent, the fairly fervent, and the not so fervent. But he had not been a month at Tonnerre before he resolutely faced the fact that while his monks were regular, their regularity was mechanical. They answered bells promptly. Every stall was occupied at the night office. But while there was good volume to the chant that rose and re-echoed in the dark silence, Robert detected little fervor. Soon he accepted the truth that the community of Tonnerre was rutted. It was easygoing, it was ordinary. But Robert was not discouraged. He found most of the monks good-natured. On that he could build. As he now sat at his desk, he determined to make his first attempt at stirring them to greater generosity on the next day, the feast of Saints Peter and Paul. Under the patronage of these men who had given all, he would place his appeal. After Mass, the community assembled in the chapter room. Robert was surprised to find his pulse rapid. He was hoping, by his effectiveness as a speaker, to startle them out of their apathy. That must be the first step in his program. He took as his text the words, "Let us make God forget." "Let us make God forget the world that is forgetting him," he said, and then painted for them a vivid panorama of the world in 1065. He told them of the gluttony that had gripped men and made them mad with a lust for power, for wealth, for personal pleasure. He used only broad, bold strokes without any shading. He omitted nothing from the indulgence of the hierarchy to the petty greed of the serfs. He called it a God-oblivious world, and begged his monks to make God forget its forgetfulness. When he had their full attention, he changed his tone and told them of the light that had flooded his mind ever since he was a novice, showing him the discrepancy between the written rule and the rule that was observed. He told them of the fire that flamed in his soul to live the monastic life a more generous way, the way of being gallant to God by living a stricter observance. Then he proposed his practices. There was to be stricter silence just to make God forget. There was to be greater solitude just to make God forget. There was to be closer adherence to the text of the rule governing food, and all was to be done just to make God forget. The ardor and enthusiasm of the moment did not distract Robert from his audience. He was watching their reactions to his every word. He saw Father Jean-Marie, the very talkative guestmaster, look uncomfortable when he spoke of silence. He noted that Father George, the procurator, did not like the appeal for greater solitude. There were quite a few who shifted about uneasily when he mentioned food. But on the whole, he thought they were taking his talk very well. As soon as Robert had left the room, one of the oldest of the fathers turned to his companion and said, "When God wants a big man, he makes him big. We've got an abbot at last. Big physically, big mentally, big spiritually. That man's heart is as big as himself, and you must admit he's no pygmy. As for his soul, yes, we've got an abbot." The other shook his head and said, "We've got a volcano, and it's far from extinct." That same day, Father Antoine came after mid-afternoon and was actually effusive. He told his abbot how moved all had been by the address. But as he went on, Robert noted that all the enthusiasm and admiration was for the rhetoric. Nothing was said of the reform. He began to doubt. Within a week, that doubt had changed to opinion. Before the month was out, that opinion gave way to certainty. There was no improvement in silence. The solitude was violated as often as ever, and there were noisy murmurs about the quantity and quality of the wine at table. Robert was disappointed, but he refused to become discouraged. 6 months later, he made another appeal. It was New Year's Day. He took as his text, "Let us make God remember." Fundamentally, it was the same address that he had given last June. He merely twisted the concept of making God forget the world to making God remember his mercies. The same panorama was presented, but the highlights this time were on the need the world had of grace. He then insisted that the two shafts certain to pierce the clouds and bring down a rain of grace were the shafts of prayer and penance. He pleaded for more heart and head in choir, even if it meant less voice. That will make God remember, he said. He asked them to be satisfied with the clothing that became poor men and rest content with the food St. Benedict prescribed. He ended each appeal with the refrain, "That will make God remember." When a number shifted their feet in evident opposition, Robert paused. "Men of God," he thundered, "I am introducing nothing new. I am only asking you to do away with what should never have been introduced." This change of attack won instant silence. "Mitigations are not for men, at least," went on the abbot. "Not for men who are anxious to be gallant to God, so anxious that they have voluntarily vowed their lives away that they might live to go to Him alone. Let me tell you that mitigations in food, in clothing, in manual labor, ill become those who have shaved their heads, so that the whole world may recognize them as slaves of Jesus Christ." Despite the flush on his face, the abbot left the room chilled that New Year's morning. He never believed men could be so cold. Father Antoine came as usual, full of compliments. Robert watched him closely, and it was on this day that he captured his elusive memory. He tried to dismiss it, but it remained. When the prior left, Robert said, "So that was it all the time, eh? The rat I saw at the famine time back in 1033. He had the same shy, nervous, sinister look in his tiny, greedy eyes." Late that afternoon, he sent for Father Charles, a short, stocky, gray-haired monk whose large, wide-set eyes were windows to a deep, generous soul. Robert felt he could trust this man's judgment and his tongue, a thing he was beginning to doubt about his prior. Father Charles assured him that there were many in the community who were anxious to follow his lead, that the complaints he heard were nothing but human nature's instinctive reactions. He then reminded Robert that he had to undermine the citadel of long-established custom, and that such undermining would take both time and labor. The abbot went to bed that night hopeful again. Before the winds of March had blown, however, those hopes had been rudely shaken. Robert suspected that someone was talking openly. There was too much uniformity to the objections raised for them to be the products of different individuals. From his prior, he could learn nothing definite. The man was cleverly evasive. The abbot could only wait and watch. As the weeks mounted, he noted that more and more often men were saying, "Father Antoine says this, and Father Antoine thinks that, and Father Prior is of the opinion." His heart lifted when he found Father Charles and a few of similar sincerity becoming more and more observant. But it soon fell when it became all too evident that they were the few and that there was no change among the vast majority. Complaints continued about the food and drink, and demands were even made for the usual high quality of clothing. He prayed earnestly those days and held long consultations with his crucifix. He began to believe that he had been too fiery, too precipitate. He had pleaded too soon and pleaded too vehemently. Perhaps he had asked too much at one time. Maybe he could achieve his end by more gradual steps. He would concentrate on one thing. Ask that and let the others go for a time. His plan seemed practical. So on March 21st, the feast of St. Benedict, he stole a page from old Abbot Bernard and gave his monks a talk in which, what would Benedict say, echoed and re-echoed. But Robert differed from Bernard inasmuch as he gave Benedict's answers by reading different chapters of the rule. It was a talk that was logically irrefutable, but psychologically unpalatable. When Robert came to the matter of manual labor, the one point he intended to stress, and asked, what would Benedict say? There was a restless stirring all over the chapter room. When he went on with, "This is what Benedict said," and began to read the rule, a distinct hiss was heard, followed by the clearly audible whispers, "Not today, that's out of date." His old impetuosity flared. "Let us truly seek God," he cried, only to hear, "We do," angrily whispered from both sides of the room. Robert looked down the two lengthy rows of men. A few were as shocked as himself, but most had hard, set faces, and many were openly murmuring. Robert found himself struggling with a temptation to lash these men mercilessly for their cowardice. To hold himself in check, he cried out in the words of the rule, "Then they are truly monks, when they live by the labor of their hands, as did our fathers and the apostles." It was at this point that Father Henri, an irritable individual, stood up and called, "Read the next sentence, read the next sentence." When Robert stared at him, he continued. It runs, "Let all things be done with moderation." Robert's eyes fell to the text of the rule. The man was right. That was the next sentence. But he had omitted the last few words. "Propter pusillanimes," for the sake of the weak. Robert's whole being craved to cry that phrase aloud, to shout it more vehemently and more scornfully than had his objector. That was the answer to the whole situation. These men were weak, but they were strong in their weakness. They were stubborn. This morning they were openly antagonistic. Robert arose. He knew that if he stayed another moment, he would deliver a diatribe. The murmurs gradually died away, but the hostile looks remained. Raising his right hand in blessing, the young abbot said, "Pax, peace be to you," and walked from the room with all the majesty and dignity of a king. At that moment, externally, he was the most self-contained and controlled man in the assembly, but inwardly he was seething with passion, and his heart was sick and very, very sore. It lacked an hour to Mass time when Father Antoine knocked on the abbot's door. In his hands was the text of the rule. He bowed and smiled to Robert, his eyes cunning and sinister. "If you have a few moments, Reverend Father, I would like to propose a few questions." Robert gestured toward a chair, but the prior said, "I'll stand, Reverend Father." He waited. Was St. Benedict ironical or rhetorical when he wrote his rule, Reverend Father, or did he write his mind sincerely? Robert glanced down at his desk. His eyes met the crucifix. The sight steadied him. "I think that question answers itself, Father," he said quietly. "I think so too," said the prior, and his lips parted in a shallow smile. Holding out the text of the rule, he went on. "Then when he writes in the prologue that he is about to establish a school of the service of God, in which we hope we will ordain nothing rigorous or burdensome, he really meant it. His words are to be taken literally, are they not? Surely the boy who fled from the schools of Rome, Scientarnesius, as his biographer quaintly phrases it, was not being rhetorical." Robert gripped himself inwardly, for he felt his anger rising. "He is to be taken literally, Father." The prior laid the text of the rule down on the desk. "In fact, that is the keynote of his whole rule, isn't it, Reverend Father? Nothing harsh, nothing burdensome. You know, when we compare Benedict's rule with the records of the monks of Egypt, or even with the rules practiced in Europe in his day, we find that Benedict's is the easiest of all rules. I think that is historically true, Father, said Robert, digging his nails into his palms to hold his calm. What follows? Antoine's lips were still smiling, but the film lifted from his eyes for a second as he said, "Doesn't it follow that St. Benedict's rule is not a penitential rule? That his spirit is one of moderation?" Robert said nothing. The prior went on. "Doesn't it seem significant that nowhere in his rule does the saint use the word mortification?" "Does he use the word mitigation?" burst Robert. He felt it was a mistake the moment he had spoken it. He should not enter into argument with this man. His heart was too sore, too aflame. The very sight of Antoine stirred the deepest resentment within him. He had his eyes on the crucifix, but he did not miss the confident way the prior's hands went out toward the text of the rule. "Chapter 40, said Antoine silkily, runs, "Though we read that wine is not for monks at all, yet as monks in our day cannot be persuaded of this, let us at least use it sparingly. That, I think, most men would call a mitigation, Reverend Father." "Mitigation?" Robert exclaimed. "Why, that's a condemnation." But Antoine paid no heed. He laid the text before the abbot, placed his finger on chapter 49 and said, "Now, Reverend Father, here is another appeal to monastic tradition regarding austerity of life. It runs, though we read that the monk's life should at all times have the Lenten observance." That's the appeal, isn't it, Father? Robert noted the omission of Reverend, but simply nodded. Well, here is the deliberate setting aside of that tradition by mitigation. The saint goes on, "Yet as few have this courage, we urge them in these days of Lent to wash away the negligences of other times." Now that's explicit and implicit enough for anyone. Why, even in the matter of the office, Benedict was moderate. "Benedict was a very human saint, Reverend Father," said the confident prior as he turned the text back to chapter 18. "I really think that will do, Father," said Robert pointedly. "I only want to show that while Benedict recognized the fact that the old fathers of the desert recited the entire Psalter every day, he deliberately set that practice aside and would have his monks say it only once a week. Clearly mitigation, clearly a moderation, clearly a human bit of legislation. You see, Father Abbot, we here at Tonnerre are quite convinced that Benedict of Nursia was not a developer. He was a revolutionizer. He didn't take Eastern asceticism and adapt it to the West. He struck out for himself on entirely different lines. He eliminated great austerity, introduced moderation, and made his asceticism consistent in the submerging of individuality, the sinking of the individual in the common life." Robert moved the text to one side and fastened his eyes on the crucifix. This man was trying his patience more than it had been tried since the coming to Tonnerre. He hoped the tension did not show on his exterior. Inwardly, he felt tighter than a bowstring. Antoine's voice seemed to come to him from a distance as he continued. "We here at St. Michael's also know that Benedict of Avignon considered the rule of the great patriarch of the West as a rule fit only for beginners, for babies in the way of God. So, my good abbot, we have been wondering to whom you were referring this morning when you kept asking, 'What would Benedict say?' Many are of the opinion that it must have been to Benedict of Avignon." Robert arose. He towered over his prior. The latter gathered up the text of the rule, and while closing it, looked expectantly at his abbot. Robert thought he detected a flash of defiance in those eyes, but he was so deeply stirred he did not trust his judgment. "I think we had better prepare for Mass, Father," he said very quietly. There was not the slightest tremor in his voice. His look was level. Calm marked his whole bearing. But inwardly he was burning. Father Antoine looked at him from those shifty little eyes of his. He was angry to find his giant abbot so composed. "But, Reverend Father," he cried in a voice that had taken on an edge, "you haven't answered any of my questions. We here at Tonnerre—" "I happen to be one of you here at Tonnerre," broke in Robert sharply. "By the grace of God, I am abbot at Tonnerre. What means this distinction?" And his voice was as sharp as a sword. Had Antoine known Robert as Father Maurice did, he would have recognized the danger signal. But he had not Father Maurice's power of perception. Antoine had never studied men to see what was in them, but only to see what he could get out of them. He had been sorely disappointed at Robert's election. He had expected to succeed Hainault. The community's present opposition to Robert was Antoine's opportunity. He had decided to make the most of it. He had fostered discontent by sly innuendos and subtle asides. He felt his position was now safe enough to allow him to unmask. He became openly defiant. "The distinction means that you are abbot at Tonnerre, but not of Tonnerre. The distinction means that we want no reform, for we need none. The distinction means that what you call mitigations, we call rule." Robert's face was as if cut from stone. "You," cried Antoine furiously, "are not a Benedictine. You are a rebel." There was a rustle of a robe, the slam of a door, and the abbot was alone. With the slam of that door, something broke within Robert. He flung himself back into his chair, seized paper and stylus, bent over his desk and muttered, "We'll see who's abbot at Tonnerre and of Tonnerre." Then with rapid hand he wrote, "Prior, Father Charles; Subprior, Father Pachomius; Guestmaster, Father Quarantine; Procurator, Father Lambert." He looked at the list. "These men will obey. These men are loyal." Then he wrote again. There was a savage thrust to his stylus every time he dipped it in ink. He wrote, "Excommunicated, Fathers Antoine, Henri, Idzebold." "That will help them quiet for a while. That will keep them quiet for a while," he said aloud. Then he paused as he mentally ran his eyes down the list of the community. He was seeking malcontents for punishment. The murmurers he would silence by a public penance. More names darkened the paper before him. Again and again he muttered fiercely, "We'll see who's abbot at Tonnerre and of Tonnerre." Suddenly 3 strokes of a large bell broke in on his writing. "Mass," he said. "I must go. I'll finish this after dinner." As he neared the door of the church, he heard a single voice leading the chant. It was clear and confident, almost contemptuously confident. Robert recognized it. It was the voice of his prior. The man was doing his singing, as he did everything when he had an audience, magnificently. The abbot's lips pressed one another angrily. "You're efficient, Antoine, but your days of efficiency are over." At the beginning of Mass, Robert's anger was a deadly cold, seemingly implacable thing. But at the offertory, he became more attentive to the sacrifice. Father Joseph, the master of novices, was celebrant. Robert thought of his own master of novices, and from out of nowhere came the whisper of Father William's words, Study the mildness of Christ, son. Robert started. It was all of 33 years since he first heard those words. And all those 33 and 30 years he had labored to understand and imitate that mildness. And yet here he was aflame with anger. He secretly struck his breast. Before the Mass was ended, Robert was torn between the urge to righteous indignation and the urge to self-immolation. That afternoon he spent at his desk. Before him was his crucifix and the sheet of paper he had used that morning. For a long time his eyes traveled from one to the other. Then with a mighty effort he brought himself to a dispassionate review of the 14 months he had been at Tonnerre. Every effort he had made was examined coldly. He weighed the reactions of the community both as individuals and as a unit. He was painstaking in his review and as objectively honest as it is possible for a person to be. Before the sun set, the results were before him clearly. He pushed the paper aside and said, "My father was a prophet. Parallel lines do not meet. I am on one level, my community on another." He arose then and began to pace the room. The conclusion was evident, but what was he to do? There had been open antagonism in chapter. His prior had been defiant and insulting in private. There was only one thing to do: force the community to come up higher. He stood there staring at the sheet and the names he had written. His hands trembled. What of it? He thought. Fire must be met with fire. Then his eyes fell on the crucifix and the old battle began anew. Mild as Christ? Mild as Christ? Mild as Christ. The question stopped him. Robert crushed the paper in his hands angrily and began to pace the room again. He could not bring himself to accept this mutiny. He must show himself stronger than the community. Back and forth, he paced, while his thoughts kept step with his turnings. First the crucifix, then the paper. His emotions swung from anger to mildness and back to anger again. As the evening wore on, the agony grew. With the dusk it seemed that his mind came to a standstill. He could not think. He could not plan. He could not even pray. Justice and mercy, propriety and mildness were the only words that would come to him. The very monotony of the rhythm almost drove him mad. In a sort of frenzy, he threw himself on his knees and seized his crucifix in his angry hands. "Jesus!" he breathed. Again he said it, "Jesus!" Then for the long hours of the night, the only word he said was, "Jesus!" With the bell for the night office, his decision came. He told himself that it takes more strength to be mild than to be bold, that it demands more real manhood to dominate self than to domineer over others, that it calls for greater gallantry to be meek and mild like the Christ than to be a blustering commander of men. He resolved to humiliate himself rather than his monks. It was a weary and emotionally exhausted abbot who attended the vigils that morning. The community grew nervous as day succeeded day, and no reference was made to the outbreak in chapter. Robert sensed it and realized that silence was his most potent weapon at the moment. There were no apologies, no reactions, but the uneasiness grew. Robert allowed the Easter season to come on before he acted. Then one morning he opened the text of the rule to the 2nd chapter and read, "Let the abbot know that any lack of profit which the master shall find in his flock will be laid to the fault of the shepherd." After that brief passage, he looked at his community for a tense moment before saying, "Since I am preparing my judgment here at Tonnerre, and since you are writing my final sentence, I must command a more literal observance of the holy rule from this day out. Conscience permits no other course." It was Robert's final effort to arouse Tonnerre. The command was received in silence, but more than one pair of eyes sought out Father Antoine. Robert noted it and knew that the crisis had come. 2 weeks later, Father Charles knocked on his door. When Robert admitted him, he found tears brimming in the old monk's eyes. "What is it, Father?" he asked kindly. "I was wrong, Father Abbot, I was wrong. I told you once that it was only a matter of patience and time, that the community wanted to be more generous, that it really longed for a stricter observance. I was very wrong. I must have judged them from myself. They do not want reform." The old man's heart was aching. Robert laid a grateful hand on his arm, smiled, and said, "I know it, Father, but we will give them a little more time. You pray for them, and for me." "But, Reverend Father, you're right, and they are wrong." "Not wrong, Father Charles, just rutted in convention. We will continue our effort to lift them out of that rut. Pray for our success." For 6 full months, Robert continued that effort, exhausting his ingenuity in plans and stratagems. He pleaded with some, he punished others. Some he scolded, others he cajoled. But the end of the time he had set himself found him again pacing the floor in the dark of the night with the only word on his lips, Jesus. The plan that had suggested itself before came back to him. Why not remove the prior? Why not segregate the malcontents? Why not staff the monastery with the few who wanted to obey and drive the others to conformity? It was more appealing than ever. Robert suddenly felt that he had the fire to drive them, but there he stopped. That would be unworthy of himself, of his monks, and his God. God did not want snarling obedience. That belonged to brute beasts under the lash, not to men who had vowed their lives to God. But again and again the temptation came back. Finally, the crucifix called to him, and before morning he had reached the only conclusion. The next day he resigned. It was the lesson he had learned from the outstretched arms on the cross. And just as Christ had offered his supreme humiliation as a plea for the salvation of humankind, so Robert now offered his humiliation with all its bitterness as a plea for the dawn of a day when men would follow where he was so anxious to lead. Riding home, he reviewed and rationalized the whole situation. He argued that people cannot be dragooned into sanctity. That was the root of the whole difficulty. As a monk in the ranks, he could follow the interpretation of the abbot over him and know peace of soul. But as abbot, the responsibility for the correct interpretation of the rule fell on his shoulders. After 2 years, he saw that he could not shrug those shoulders. So he did the prudent, practical, and humble thing for the peace of his soul, the peace of the community under him, and the peace of the immediate monastic world around him. Rather than give up his ideals, he gave up his abbacy. He called it the humble thing, but there were those who called it heroic. But even the consolation of having done the Christ-like thing did not lift his heart. As he neared St. Pierre's, it felt leaden, for it seemed that his beautiful bubble had burst, that his first great opportunity had ended in dismal failure. He drew his cloak around him more tightly as a breeze came off the hill. The early night air was cold, so was his soul. But suddenly he caught sight of a lone star in the wide white sky. With its sparkle there came to him the echo of his father's words. Burn on until you burn out." He straightened in his saddle, put his spurs to his horse, and lifting a hand in salute to the star, cried, "I will."